thank you so much for joining me for Daily Spark with Dr. Angela. I am your host, Dr. Angela Chester, and I'm so glad to be able to spend this morning with you. You know what I like to do on Daily Spark. Say it with me, where we enlighten, inspire, and empower you to become your best self. Scripture reminds us that a tongue is a small thing that makes grand speeches, but a tiny spark can set a great forest on fire. And I want you fired up about your passion. I want you fired up about your purpose. And today I am talking to an author, and we're going to be fired up about books. My author today is Andrew-burch, and he is out of the Phoenix, Arizona area. The name of his book is Cactus Jumpers. So we're talking about choices. And why do we make the choices that we make? So let's go on and get started. Good morning, Andrew. How are you? Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me, Dr. Angel.
So you have an interesting background that I think our listeners may want to hear about. Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. I was born in Buffalo, but raised primarily in southern Connecticut. So I'm a Northeasterner for most of my life until my adulthood. But in my late 30s, I moved out to the West. I lived in Las Vegas for quite a while. And just a couple of years ago, my wife and I moved to Phoenix because we wanted to be closer to her family. Her father and stepmother both live out here. And, of course, the Western lifestyle is very different from the Eastern, not quite as rushed, and the weather is very different. It's much nicer. For me, I like the hot weather, preferable, and I've just been able to make a good living out here, and she's done well, and we've been very happy. And I have been born and raised a Catholic, so I've always had the strong Christian values. And at one point in my life, in the 80s, I did go down to Houston, Texas, and I entered St Seminary for a couple of years. I had at that time thought of becoming a Catholic priest. I did not follow through because I didn't feel that the lifestyle was quite right for me. But in the process of doing this, I learned so much about my faith and what it meant to really be a Catholic and a Christian in this world. And I've carried that on ever since, and it's been very important. In fact, my wife and I share Christian values, and that's one of the reasons that we're together to this day after 17 years is because we have those common values, and that's something that we try to carry on in our life every day.
And I'm so glad that you said that, because someone really needed to hear that it really is our belief system, our values that are important to us. And when everything else is kind of going a little wonky around you, at least you know that you're able to meet in the middle on those points, that you're able to have that as your foundation. So switching to your book, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, it was kind of funny. I've been a reader since I was a kid. Even when I was in elementary school, I just loved to read. I'd read anything, comic books, magazines, any books that I could understand. And as years went by, I found that as being a very important part of my life. It was sort of that peaceful escape time when I could relax and enjoy a story. And I loved particularly mysteries. I loved various types of books at that time. I did have a little while where I read some of the horror genre, but I kind of got away from that. What I will say is that when I got in the early 2000s, I noted that most of the books were really nonfiction. That began to dominate our area of writing a novel. And I was unhappy with that because I wanted more fiction. That was my passion. And I suddenly realized, you know what, why don't I stop complaining and just write something myself, a story that I would enjoy, right? And I would just let me write it the way I'd write it, the way I'd like to read it, and a story that has a theme to it that I'm interested in, and do it myself. So I started thinking about a story, and it kind of started clicking in my head, And one day I just sat down and started typing it out. And, it took me a while to do it. I was still working full time. So, I only got to do it on a part-time basis. And 1 year I changed jobs, and that really slowed me down because, with a new job and the new learning curve and so much stress involved, I didn't do a lot of writing in that second year. But then I kind of caught up in my third year. I got inspired again. It just started happening. And next thing I knew, I was rolling along and almost finished. And then I accidentally mentioned to my mom that I was doing it because I hadn't told anybody but my wife. And she said, "Oh, you got to finish so I can read it." Because my mom has macular degeneration, so her eyesight was going away. And I said, I've got to finish before she loses her eyesight completely because she wants to read it. So that kind of pushed me through to the end to get it finished. And, of course, I went to agents and publishers and got turned down. So I ended up self-publishing, and that's how I got it out there finally.
Well, let me tell you, there are a lot of self-published books that are awesome. And I think in today's world, people are starting to look past the self-published label that gets put on a lot of stuff because there are some really great writers that, unfortunately, every publishing house just can't take everyone, and some good folks really do slide through the cracks. So I don't think my listeners necessarily mind if you are self-published or not, because a good book is a good book. Now, you mentioned something about inspiration, and I like to ask my authors the kind of questions that I think maybe a young writer might want to know, or someone who's thinking about writing. Nothing too difficult, but always interesting to hear. And that question is this: what type of environment do you need when you're writing? Like, is it what we hear about in the movies where you go off to the cabin and you're all by yourself, or you rent a hotel room and you're just cranking out the book in a weekend? What's the perfect environment for you for writing?
Well, I guess that depends on what kind of environment you have at home. And if it is very distracting and noisy and you have a lot of kids or something, that could be a reason why a writer might step away. For myself, it was just my wife and I, and therefore all I did was go into the computer room and type on the computer. She didn't disturb me, and I was able to write because my thoughts were coming clear. And I didn't have any difficulty really writing at all. Like I said, I had that 1 year where things slowed down, but that had nothing to do with the environment I was in. I think it was just my situation at the time, and primarily that I was maybe facing a little bit of writer's block, or I just didn't have the drive to get there and do it. But I was never distracted by anything around me, so I didn't need to remove myself from my typical environment.
Now, you mentioned writer's block. Some writers believe that they get it. Some believe that they don't. Some believe it's temporary. How did you deal with your version of writer's block whenever you experienced it?
Well, for me, it wasn't about not knowing what to write. It was about having the energy and the drive to sit down and write it. And so for me, it was a wait and see. I didn't want to force it because then I wouldn't have written as well. I would have been kind of forcing the words down and trying to get them out there and say, well, let me at least get this chapter done. So I was a wait and see. I was not a published author, not somebody with a deadline. So it wasn't necessary for me to hurry. I think if some people are on a deadline and they're really needing to do it, I would say step away for a few days and just relax yourself and then come back to it. But like I said, for me, it was not a deadline situation, so I was able to give it as much time as I needed to.
And, you made a really good point there because you are imposing the deadline upon yourself as opposed to someone else doing it. You could move when you needed to move the way that you needed to move, and that, I'm sure that does make a really huge difference. Now, getting to your book, it's a Western, it's a mystery. Why did you choose a Western and a mystery?
Well, I would have to say it's because of the two things that I love the most when it comes to fiction and enjoying myself. I was a Western fan really because when I was a kid, I would watch things like the Cisco Kid and the Rifleman and shows like that on syndicated TV. But then one time we went to a movie, and this was funny. My parents took myself, my brother and sister, and we went to a movie to see this double feature. Now, this is back in those days when they had such a thing. And the first feature was a Peanuts movie, a Charlie Brown movie, and that's what I'm thinking, that's what I'm going to want to watch. But the second was a Western. It was a John Wayne Western called Big Jake, and I loved that so much that it really pushed me in that direction, that I wanted to see as many Western shows, as many Western movies as I could, and started watching a lot of the old movies that were coming on, and gave me a real feel for the Western itself. And my feeling of, in this day and age, we have so much technology, and I like seeing things a little bit more visceral, a little bit more down to earth, where we didn't have technology. People worked hard to come up with ways to survive, to succeed, to endure. And when they dealt with each other, they didn't deal with each other on a cell phone. They came face to face and talked. And that was just something that I always liked and always was interested in. And that inspired me to go with the Western motif, because I felt like I like it so much. That's probably the best way for me to go, since I'll be comfortable writing about it. I enjoy Westerns, so it would make me feel better about writing a Western itself. And then as far as the mystery goes, that came in actually a little bit later. I had started writing the book. I had a basic idea of what I wanted, but there was a conflict I needed as part of my story, and I said, man, how am I going to get these characters to really go to the extremes that they're going to go to? Because normally people say that's just not worth it. So I realized, what if there was a murder involved? That causes desperation. People get so concerned about it that they would go to the extremes to try and deal with the situation on each side of the question. And I love mysteries. I've been a big fan of mysteries, the Agatha Christie and the Sherlock Holmes for so many years. And I thought, well, why not put that in there? And so that became my driving point, what you put into the story to make the people act upon what's happening. So I decided to include the mystery element. And this actually worked out very well, because the overall theme was on the choices people make, what people do, why they do it, and there is a sense of morality and values involved. And that's why the murder mystery actually became a very important key element as to who the victim was, because the victim was somebody that was considered unimportant, and a lot of people felt, the characters felt like, why should we go through all this trouble for her sake? What was she to us? And that brings up that whole question of, are we all important? Does it matter who we're talking about? Are we not all equal in the eyes of the Lord? And that's why I felt like this really made the story even more emotional and gave it more depth and made the characters more interesting, because there was a lot of the characters that could look at this and say, why am I even getting involved in this? What was she to me? And that's why the story itself was able to progress as it did. Because I'll tell you right now, when I sat down to write the story, I had about 50 pages of ideas in front of me. The story ended up being 350 pages. So it grows, it comes to life as I'm writing it. It was just taking on a life of its own and carrying me along with it. And that's because of these different elements that got involved in the story.
Wow, that is, I really love how you explain that. Unfortunately, it is time for us to take a break, so listeners, don't go anywhere. We will be back right after this. And we are back. Thank you so much for joining me for a Daily Spark with Dr. Angela. My guest today is Andrew-Burch, and he is out of the Phoenix, Arizona area. He's author of Cactus Jumpers, So today we're talking about choices and why we make the choices that we do. So Andrew, what is the story of, I want to back up just a little bit because I want to ask a twofold question. Why the name Cactus Jumpers, and what is the story about?
Well, Cactus Jumpers was just something that jumped into my head. I was just looking for a title just for a place point at the moment. I didn't really intend that to be the final title. I just wanted something to refer to with all of my notes, so I just put that title out there. And actually in chapter 28, which is called Cactus Jumpers, it does explain it. I remembered a scene from the movie Magnificent Seven in which Steve McQueen's character was describing how a fella jumped into a cactus plant and afterwards said it seemed like a good idea at the time. And I don't know why, but that always stuck out in my head. And so I was just thinking of that and saying, Cactus Jumpers. And I just put it out there. And then as I explain the story, you'll see why it fits in and stayed as the title. Because the story is really about a young girl is found dead. Now, in this case, her body is actually hidden under the water by somebody. They weighed it down. And that makes it pretty obvious that this isn't an accident. This isn't just a happenstance. It's not just a mugging of some sort along the roadway. Somebody killed this girl and hid the body because they didn't want anyone to ever know about it. There was a great fear on their part about this coming back to them. And these children who actually find the body are related to the main characters. The one boy, Eddie, is the son of the town minister, and the other two are the children of the town marshal. And they go back and tell them, oh, look what we found, and they're all excited because they found something amazing. It's kind of like Stand By Me movie where they go to see the dead body. And they're just excited because they've got big news. But for the marshal and for the minister, whose name is Emmett Brady, there's a great concern about what will this do to our town. The town is called Emerald. It's a fictional town in Northern California. The time period is around 1890. They're not too far away from some of the big cities, but they are still somewhat isolated. And this is very unusual for them. A death is one thing, but a murder is something that they just don't see very often. It's not a common occurrence. And it creates a lot of fear. Because now they're thinking, well, was this a drifter? Or was this somebody that lives here amongst us, that we're looking over our shoulders? And if they think we're suspicious, are they going to do something to us? And this is a concern that Emmett Brady has. His wife has, the marshal and his wife have. Pursuing this could rake up a lot of dirt. It could cause a lot of problems. And in the process of doing this, there is a certain element within the town. There is a particular powerful rancher, as well as what we would call a town boss, somebody who owns a lot of businesses. And they don't want this murder investigated. And they start putting subtle and then not so subtle pressure on the marshal to forget this. You know, it's not important. When they identify the girl and determine that she's just a young prostitute that's only been there for a little less than a year, they try to emphasize, why are you going to ruin somebody's life or create a problem over this girl? She's not important. But see, for Emmett Brady, everybody's important. And his wife, whose name is Elizabeth, feels very strongly the same way. You just don't disregard people. You don't say, hey, that person doesn't matter, so we won't bother with this. Let's just put it aside. And the marshal has a family, has a wife and 2 children, so he knows that his actions are going to have consequences, not just for him, but for them as well. And there is a great concern on his part about what if something happens to him, what will they do, or what if they are threatened in some way. And the pressure starts to become a little greater as things progress to where the people that want to shut him up are actually implying that there could be some harm to the family, and that creates a greater concern for the marshal. he realizes that his back is against the wall, and the one person that he's able to rely on is Emmett Brady, the town minister, who has the same feeling. However, Emmett has vowed to his wife since they got married, he will never pick up a gun again. He will never use any type of violence. Now he's stuck with the decision, well, what do I do about that? Because if I don't try to stand up and help the marshal physically, how can I help him? And again, his approach is going to be to try and work through a faith-based spirituality, hoping that things that he can do will help out. But there's just so much opposition. People in town are afraid. They don't want to get involved. They're in that same mindset of it's really not worth it. And as a result, the marshal decides he's going to push ahead because it's his duty to do so. And there are some other characters that come into the mix. And these are very important characters, which I'll get into in more detail later in the interview, but I want to just emphasize that other people have to make decisions as well. And when it comes to being a cactus jumper, one of the people who works for the rancher, Moss Williams, said, I would rather jump over a cactus than challenge Moss Williams. And that's where the whole idea of these are people that are willing to take that chance. They're willing to put themselves in harm's way and jump over a cactus if it's the right thing to do. And that's where I think part of the question comes in. What is it worth to you? Why are you doing this? And they're not going to get anything out of it except it's the right thing to do. And that's really the main theme, is that people every day have to make choices. Can you take the easy way out, or do you take the hard way? Why? Because the hard way might be the right thing to do, but you still should do that anyway. It doesn't mean just because you have an easy out that you should take it. And you don't have to get something in return in order for you to want to go ahead and do the right thing. And that's really what happens with these characters in this book. And the conflict continues to build and, of course, becomes at some point violent in its nature, forced upon by the people who want to try and quiet this entire situation. So it has a lot of elements of classic Westerns, which you might have seen from things like Rio Bravo and Rio de Janeiro and movies of that sort, which are both John Wayne movies, by the way. And it has that element. But I like to go in more deeply to the idea of what is motivating the characters and why are they doing what they're doing and what should we do? Do we think that way?
I like it. I love it. It sounds like such an interesting story. That it would make a great movie too. You know, that you could just see it. Well, if you're into westerns, I know that there are some people going, yeah, I like westerns too. That would really make a great show. Now, you mentioned about the characters, and I do want to give you a minute or two to talk about that. What can you share more about the characters?
Well, first of all, they're not flat. Okay, these characters all have backstories, which I present through flashbacks, and there is a great deal of explanation as to who they are and where they come from. So that it's not just somebody shows up on the scene and does something that matches the story. They have a background. The minister, Emmett Brady, actually was an orphan who then, spent his time fooling around doing various things, worked in a carnival and such. But he was encouraged by an older Native American, and he referred to him as Old Joe, who really gave him a good vision for the future. And, of course, Emmett, being young and immature, didn't pick up on that until after Old Joe had passed away. And later on realized, my gosh, this is what he was trying to tell me. And then his relationship with his wife Elizabeth occurs when he meets her family and becomes a part of that. And he adopts their Christian principles and becomes a minister. And his whole idea is helping others, because to make their life better actually makes this world a better place. And then you have, a marshal who stands by his principles, and he has a wife and 2 kids. And it's more important to him to show them that you have to stick by your principles and you have to do the right thing than it is to say, I'm going to keep you safe by not following up on this, because it would be the wrong example. Both he and Emmett Brady have that problem. There are some other characters now. There is a man by the name of Trace Allen. Trace is first introduced in the 5th chapter called Monster, in which we learn about the history that he has growing up in an abusive household with an alcoholic, abusive father. And, of course, what that creates is that whole attitude of, I don't trust anybody. I'm on my own. I don't want anyone around me because they're going to turn on me, because he had that kind of a background. And there are two black ladies by the name of Jade and Crystal. How they got their names and where they come from is all explained throughout the book. These three end up becoming traveling mates and very close friends, and they stick together, and they're all very defiant. Their attitude is, if you want to cause problems with us, come on. We're ready for you. You know, they stand up for themselves very well. And they are just happen to be passing through this town at the time. And for the most part, you would think, well, it has nothing to do with them. They can just leave anytime they want, so they don't need to get involved. But they do end up getting involved, and there are reasons for it. And it all falls back to that. You know what? If we do the right thing all the time, we wouldn't have so many of the problems that we have. And for us to just turn and walk away because it's none of our business, well, that doesn't really make sense, because now they're saying we want other people to suffer the way we did in the same fashion. And that's not right. There is a wonderful song written by David Gilmour for Pink Floyd. And in 1987, they had an album called Temporary Lapse of Reason. And the one song was called On the Turning Away. And that song, when I listened to it, I realized it fit beautifully with my theme. The idea of, yeah, you can turn your back on things and just hope they go away or that they won't affect you in any way, but you're only making the world a worse place. It's not going to get better. You have a responsibility to step up and do something and try to help people that are in need. And that's why Chapter 31 is called On the Turning Away. I took that title directly from that song. And that is a turning point for those characters, for the minister and for the three drifters that have come in, because that's when they start to understand, why does this matter to us? And once they get that in their heads, they realize we have to take a stand, even though we could walk away from it. That's very important as far as the book goes and as far as what the characters do. And there are some other characters. Now, Moss Williams is a rancher. He is involved. You know, there is an involvement. He is concerned about his family, his reputation, his life, the wealth that he's built up over the years. And he's taking a stand that, hey, we don't need to lose all this because of some girl, some prostitute. And there is a town boss who has his own motivations for helping Moss Williams. And those are explained as they go on. Now, this town boss, he actually was a son of a successful businessman who was strong-willed. But the difference with the successful businessman is he had a certain point of ethics. When his son takes over, he doesn't have that same ethical standpoint. He feels like, I can do a lot more than my dad did because I don't draw the line here. And as a result, he starts stepping over the line and doing things he shouldn't be doing and doesn't think there's anything wrong with it. So his involvement with this rancher becomes really, it has to do with a mutual need. But this fellow, Skip Traeger, becomes very, very much involved in trying to shut down the investigation. And even more so than Moss, Skip Traeger is ruthless. He'll go to any lengths to try and stop it. And there are several other characters, but one that I would point out is Billy Sampson. He's a black man that works as the foreman on the Moss Williams Ranch. And very few people would have ever given him the opportunity that Moss Williams did. And when he gets caught in the middle of this, he now has his choice. Do I stand by the man who's done so much for me, or do I stand by what I know is right? And he, too, has a backstory that appears, you know, at some point in the book later on, where we understand why he makes the choice that he does. Why would he go up there and say, I can't allow this to continue? And why would he show any support for the marshal? So these characters, because of their backgrounds, because of what they've been through, make choices. The choices sometimes are right, sometimes are wrong, but there is a reason for what they do. I don't create any characters that are just flat characters that have no history and just exist because they fit into the story. I was very careful about that. I want it to be honorable to my readers and say, look, I've got a character here, but there's a reason for the character. I didn't just pull them out of thin air and say I'm going to use them.
That is amazing. I love how each person, each character is really and truly bringing something to the story, and they're not just someone that's kind of dragging along and you're going, well, why is that person still in there? It was really, really intriguing. I love it. Well, listeners, it is time for us to go to a break, but don't you go anywhere. We'll be back right after this. And we are back. Thank you so much for joining me for Daily Spark with Dr. Angela. I am Dr. Angela Chester. My guest today is Andrew-Burch, and he is the author of Cactus Jumpers. We're talking about choices today, folks, and why do we make the choices that we make, and how can we grow and learn from them? So, Andrew, when we talk about writing style, and everyone has their particular style and what's really comfortable for them, what influences do you feel appear in your writing style?
You know, it's interesting that I have a wide variety because I've read so much all my years growing up. I was exposed to so many different styles. I'll tell you one that might surprise you, and that is Stephen King. Now, I really haven't been following the horror genre for a long time, but when I was younger and I read some of his books, what I really loved was his style of storytelling. He would introduce the characters and then slowly bring them together. So he was like weaving a web, where he would have these different corner pieces, and then he'd start pulling the threads together and tying them together. And so I went about it that way. I actually wrote several chapters before I even had my definite plot line because I was introducing characters. And as the story goes along, you can start seeing the characters interact. And here's what's happening, and why are they a part of this story, and why did I introduce them earlier on? And that, I think, came from that whole idea that Stephen King likes to write books where he introduces the characters, and he introduces some of the themes, but he doesn't put them out there 100%. He brings them together as time goes by. And that was a very influential part of how I wrote. Now, when I wrote the book, I had no idea I was actually doing that. I didn't realize I was following Stephen King. It was later when I looked back and said, oh, you know, that's how he writes. That's probably where I got that from. And, of course, because I was a fan of his style of storytelling. But I also was a fan of some classic novels, including Charles Dickens. And Dickens, he had a habit of creating a lot of characters, a rainbow of characters. And I like that because in my feeling is as you walk through life, there are people you encounter briefly that you may not realize you've had an impact on their life. They may not realize they had an impact on yours. And as I'm writing the story, I'm realizing I created all these background characters. I just wrote names for them just so I would know what to call them when they showed up. But as I was going through the story, I said, well, that person actually has a little bit more to do with this story than I originally intended. I think I need to give a little more backstory on that character. And what was so important to me was all these characters deserved recognition for the role that they played in the overall story. So I ended up with a lot of characters. And some people don't like that. Some people think, oh, it's too much to keep track of. And I'm sorry about that. But for me, in everyday life, I keep track of the characters in my life. I keep track of the people that influence me or that I encounter, and I remember them. Sometimes I don't recall their names exactly, or I don't recall everything about them, but they're a part of my life. They're part of my story. So in this particular novel, there were a lot of characters. And I think that's because something that I liked from Charles Dickens was he used a lot of characters in his stories. And it really also makes people invest in reading the novel. Because when they're reading it, they say, who is that again? Maybe they have to go back and look. And it helps them to really be more involved in the story itself, where they can start remembering, oh, yeah, I remember that guy. Yeah, I remember what happened to him. And now it becomes more like they're standing there watching these events instead of just reading them in a book. So I like to try to draw people in. And, of course, as we know, the more characters involved, the more likely something's going to touch one of the readers. They're going to see something in there and say, that was me. I remember that, or I knew somebody just like that. So the opportunity to get more of an investment occurs by having more characters. So if I only had 3 or 4 main characters and didn't pay much attention to the others, the chances are less that I would be touching the reader. But by having a large, wide variety and array of characters, now I've got a better chance that something's going to click with somebody that's reading it and saying, ooh, that would be me. What does this person do? I want to see how this person reacts. So I think that was the reason that I did have so many characters and why I was so determined not to leave people out in the story itself, and why I went into so much background and flashbacks. And then the obvious influences beyond that are the Westerns and the mysteries that I've been reading and watching for years. They had a big influence too. You know, how do characters approach things? I went out of my way to use, in this case, I used a minister as opposed to using a Catholic priest. And somebody say, well, why didn't you use a Catholic priest? You're a Catholic. Well, because I wanted the minister to have a family. And a Catholic priest can't get married and have family. So I wanted the person who represented a church, Christian values in this story, to have other people that they felt like they had to answer to. People like, you know, what does my wife think if I do this? You know, what message am I giving to my son? The same thing was true on the side of the marshal. Most times, if you think about Westerns, especially you think about these John Wayne movies or TV shows like Gunsmoke and such, the marshals are always single. They're stand-up characters. They do what they do because they believe in it. But they take the consequences on themselves. Very rarely does somebody else have to suffer for what they're going to do. So they don't really turn to anyone else and say, what do you think? I didn't want that. So my marshal, specifically in this case, had to be married with kids because there had to be consequences affecting other people besides himself. There had to be other influences in his life that would influence the decisions he was going to make. In contrast to that, his deputy is a single guy. In fact, he has a criminal background and is trying to get away from all that. But you see where he now is looking at things very differently. It's just him on the line. But what does he think? Does he feel like this is worth it for him to get involved? And you would think that he would be more willing than the marshal, and yet that's not really the case in this story. You know, everybody has their own motivations, but I wanted to make sure that there was a good, solid family background to go along with the other characters that are in the story. Moss Williams has a wife and a teenage son. Now here he's thinking about his relationship to his wife and how it's soured over the years and things haven't been quite right. And he's thinking about his son and how there's been a distance between them, and he'd like to bring that back, close the distance. And how does this all affect that intent on his part, this whole case, because it does involve him. So what I'm looking for really is to show how do people react, not within a vacuum, but within a society which starts with family and then grows outward. How do they react? The townspeople, the fears that they have. This is something that, again, I saw in a lot of old Westerns and in other stories too, where people would say, I've got a family. I can't take a chance. I know I should do this, but I don't want them to get hurt. And there is a fear that steps in. Sometimes it's an alibi when they're saying they don't want their family to get hurt. Sometimes it's genuine. But the end result is, are they walking away from something that they shouldn't and not doing something that they should for a reason that really isn't correct? You know, are they actually doing more harm to their family and their loved ones and their neighbors by walking away from the situation than if they went in and actually tried to do something about it? So that's where I really come from as far as my thoughts on what happens in the story and the influences that I've had. And, you know, I've been reading so many different types of books, you know, and I read the Bible on a regular basis. So when I read in the Bible, I'm thinking about things like that. Why do people do what they do? Is it just faith in God? Are there other reasons? And when they don't do the right thing, what is the reason? And you really understand, I understand more the message that Jesus gives us because he's talking to me. And I understand, you know what, I would have probably made the wrong decision in that situation. And he's telling me, go in this direction. I know it looks difficult, but this is the way you need to go. And that doesn't make as much sense when I look at myself in a vacuum and say, it's just me. I really have to think about other people in order for those things to have an impact on me, because my choices aren't made by myself. I have to make them. I have to consider my wife. I have to consider all my family members, you know, my father-in-law, my mother-in-law, my mother and brothers and sister. I have to think about all of them when I'm making a decision about what I'm going to do. So that's very important and had a big influence. So I would even say that even the Bible had a big influence on what I was writing in this novel.
I love how you said just reading the Bible and spending time with the Creator, that we're able to see who we are on such a broader scale, but at the same time pull out some of those organic things that we have that we're able to share with others. What do you hope to accomplish not only with this book, but with your writing from a very broad perspective?
Well, when I wrote the book, I made very clear in my mind the decision that I was going to write this for entertainment purposes. I wanted people to have something to enjoy so I could bring something positive into their lives. And we all know that that's a lot of what reading is about, is sometimes getting away from the difficulties of life. That's what I wanted. But there is a message there as well, and I hope that they pick up on that message and try to understand it and recognize from the diversity of characters I have that this isn't just about your fellow Christians. It's about everybody and how you relate to everyone, and that there are a lot of people that are not of our own faith that nonetheless have the same values and the same interests in life. So I would hope that people would see that. I've never expected any great financial success, but I would really love for people to read it for the sake of reading it.
Mm-hmm. Well, Andrew, I want to make sure that everyone is able to stay in contact with you. So if you would, please, what is the best way for people to find you on social media or on the internet?
Okay, I have a Facebook page. It's andrew-burch. That's B-U-R-C-H. I also have an Andrew-Burch Cactus Jumpers Facebook page. But then there's also a website called andrew-burch.com, where I have the book itself. I have comments, and there are a lot of reviews that have been done on the book already. And people can definitely stay in contact with me through that and leave information. I'll be glad to talk with people about anything they want to talk about in the book. And if enough people are interested, maybe I'll write another one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for having that positive outlook. I love it. Thank you so much, Andrew, for being on the show today.
Well, thank you for having me, Dr. Angela. I really appreciate you and your show and your audience.
And listeners, thank you so much for joining me for Daily Spark with Dr. Angela. May the Lord continue to shine his face upon you. May you receive his grace and his mercy in all that you do. Bye-bye.